When we say we want to do something like restructure beginning design curriculums and that of schools of architecture and design, we're talking about tampering with something that has very long traditions. And traditions aren't bad. Can actually be very good. But what happens when we stop taking critical look at things and we stop having an analysis of what works and what doesn't work, that's when things can get very, very dangerous. When we take a look at architecture and we take a look at how people are educated, rather, to be architects, we have very little inquiry about the methods in which we're delivering education. Most of the things that we talk about are what's being taught, talking about new technologies and new structural systems and new even areas of style. But we're not taking enough look at what it means for someone to learn. And that we have to turn to the fields of education and developmental psychology, where we see great leaps and changes over several years, where people discover new truths and new information, and they say, well, wait a second, maybe we can look at how we teach kids. Maybe we can look at how we actually learn and begin to play with the idea of learning in general. And so this paper takes a look at why or how we can look at architecture education and begin to ask the same questions that we do in the field of education. What does it mean for someone to learn? What's the most efficient way for people to learn? What are new ways for people to learn the fields of design? Contemporary design curriculums have their roots in three very distinct education models, that being the German Polytechnic, the Beaux-Arts, and the Bauhaus traditions. But it's the Bauhaus that we have to thank for the creation of beginning design curriculums of what they coined basic design. So it's the basic design curriculum where we actually want to take a step back now and look at its culture, look at its underpinning educational philosophies, and begin to ask questions of where it might be changed, where it might be restructured to achieve its overall educational agenda. The first thing I'd like to do is debunk two concepts I see swimming around in the design studio. And the first, I call these things myths. And the first I call the myth of the all-knowing expert. And the myth can be understood two ways. The idea that the role of a design student is to take a path to become this all-knowing expert. And also the idea that the studio professor or the studio instructor, who is usually in charge of the setting the tone of the educational learning environment, that they also are somehow this all-knowing expert. And the instructor's role for the design studio presents much contradiction in what the design studio claims to be. Many people would paint the design studio as a constructivist environment, and the idea of constructivism saying where students are learning through inquiry, they're learning with their hands, and somehow through this process over weeks, they're discovering truths for themselves. But when we put the instructor as the all-learning expert, and we begin to put that in the scenario, we see that something else is at play. And we see strong roots of objectivism. In an objectivist learning model, we see knowledge is transmitted directly from the instructor to the student. And in these types of cases, we see students who will sit and look for truth and knowledge directly from the instructor instead of taking the path of constructivism and finding inquiry for themselves. Donald Schoen's writings in The Reflective Practitioner illustrates all of the good and bad of this tension between this constructivist and objectivist learning environments that are always at play and always at tension, that are seemingly visible in the design studio. He writes in a book and illustrates this two characters, one by the name of Quist and the other one of Petra, the typical relationship between a design studio professor and the design studio student, and depicts how they interact with each other. In one end, he talks about how Quist, the studio professor, is trying to go through the dialogue of sketching and reframing the question for the student. And in these cases where the student is stuck, it's obviously clear that they need some type of guidance to help them get to the next hurdle. This is very similar to what we mentioned earlier about the notion of scaffolding, in which the instructor is there to kind of just push along the student just to the next level. However, Sean is able to then take that character and paint them more as the role of coach. And that's where I would begin to rename the role of the instructor and not begin to see instructors as the all-knowing expert, but more of the encouraging coach. And the role of the coach, the role of the instructor is to demonstrate different ideas. And by the student imitating them, they're not imitating by rote, but they're looking and seeing new ways of seeing the design problem, new ways of possibly approaching it. Coach's role are to demonstrate and the student is to imitate. But when the student begins to imitate by rote and mindlessly, the student can begin to fall into an automated process. And that is where we want to discourage this idea of rote behavior, and where we'll talk about later the idea of calculation, visual calculation, that can allow students a mechanism to begin to do this notion of copying and imitation without mindlessly doing it. And instead, we want them to mindfully doing this. The second myth is what I call the myth of creative individuality. Now, some would make the case that the design studio was some type of vibrant hub of collaboration and group learning is occurring at every whim. And in fact, there is a big component of design studios where students do talk with each other and they have dialogue about their work. But just because the studio is structured in a way and where students work together in small groups does not mean that the students will automatically engage in peer-to-peer learning. The social scientist Richard Hackman calls this phenomenon co-acting groups, where members are working in proximity to each other with the same supervisor, but each have individual projects. Another sign of this type of behavior is that these are not what he calls real teams. Just because students are working in close proximity with each other doesn't mean that they actually are doing work that's codependent upon each other. As a result, oftentimes the design studios have students that are working close by each other, but in the end are depending upon themselves for their success. In truth, many students see that the design process is best learned individual, and that only through individual efforts can they be most creative. And part of the reason for the design studio's misguided educational philosophy, that the design is best learned individual, comes from the profession's perspective on creativity and originality. Although the Bauhaus was great for solidifying constructivism in the design studios, it also must carry some of the blame for the seeds of objectivism we see prevalent in architecture studios today. Students often expect from their instructors explicit directions in the design knowledge. The attention paid to star designers and the re-embodiment of the guild system with its master-apprentice relationships are all instituted by the Bauhaus and could still be seen the traces in today's studios. Design juries, another tradition stemming from the Beaux-Arts and the Bauhaus, personifies objectivism. Students look to these perceived outside experts for confirmation and assessment of their design decisions. In order for design studios to truly be restructured, we must revisit some of these practices established from years ago. So how do we promote constructivism in the studio? How do we promote coaching behavior for instructors? How do we improve opportunities for collaborative learning? All of the restructuring, for me, begins with a redefinition of what it means to design. We must understand design as a form of calculation. With every form of design and every action that we perform in the design process, we can understand this as a form of calculation. We calculate for firmness, we calculate for commodity, we even calculate for delight. And the ways in which we go about calculating defines the process of design and should be the very focus of instruction. Once we provide formal definitions for what it means to be creative and what it means to create design decisions, we can therefore expand the roles of constructivism and expand the way we instruct and also provide new opportunities for collaboration. Although over the years many people have looked at the intersection between design and calculation, I believe shape grammar stands out as one of the strongest viable solutions for presenting visual calculation as a means to understand design. Shape grammars breaks down the design process by producing a series of rules and steps that one can follow to be creative. Now, at first glance, many think that a formal design process with rules can be very constraining. But shape grammars is flexible in a way that allows one to be open-ended and to expand the rule set as one goes along the design process. In truth, the art of playing with shape grammars is fun and a form of play. The importance of play in learning has been well documented by several educators and is one of the strongest elements that I think is lacking in design students today. In the design studio today, students simply aren't playing enough. But at the same time, when we talk about adding shape grammars, a formal system, one thinks that this is not playful. In fact, shape grammars and visual calculation can be the most playful form of learning about design that is out today. Two essential elements in shape grammars that are essential for the play element is both embedding and recursion. Embedding and recursion allows for the mind to constantly look and see and change its mind. It's never being locked in, it's always being open to seeing new things. Through recursion and embedding, shape grammars becomes flexible in a non-fixed system to allow students to design in a very formal rule base, but also flexible with endless amounts of possibilities. The notion of seeing, and seeing with the eye, and being able to change the mind on what one sees, is an essential element to design. Shape grammars allows a formal definition to be a companion to this way of seeing. In the book Homo Ludens, the author Hutzwinger refers to the phenomena of play as being in the magic circle. The magic circle is a time where people can have make-believe ideas and imagine a whole world described by play. Shape grammars is the magic circle for designers. One of the easiest entry points for one to understand shape grammars and the idea of rules in the design process as a playful learning activity comes in the form of kindergarten grammars. In early design studios and beginning design, the Bauhaus created something called the 9-square design problem. The 9-square design problem represents one of the first stages of playing with rules. This stage makes every element that one plays with a zero-dimensional element, and in the end, the process is combinatorial. So, in the state of playing with Legos or playing with blocks, one adds a rule system to attach pieces to each other, 0 plus 0. There is no embedding, but there can be recursion. And at the end, a student can see the relationship between using a role, adding pieces, and seeing a design evolve. A fresh approach to the 9 design problem would be to see, instead of a kit of parts, look at the design as a kit of actions. In this way, we are not focused on the zero-dimensionality of objects, but objects can then embed and infuse into each other and take on 1, 2, and 3 dimensions. Each component of the kit of parts is irrelevant as we now pay attention to the kit of actions. The rules and the set of rules that one establishes becomes the elements of play. And by following the rules, adding rules, and even in some cases breaking rules, one can see their design evolve. Moving, rotating, scaling, and even mirroring, to name a few, are now the design moves in the kit of actions that becomes the palette for the designer to keep on designing and stay within the magic circle of learning and play. This formal description of design, allowing one to see the relationship between the rules one follows and the actions they perform, actually expands the way in which students can collaborate together. No longer will students have to be satisfied with design being a mystery in a creative process that cannot be described, but they can look at a formal system to describe their actions. They can then share these actions with others and begin to enhance and remix and change their actions with others to make an even larger palette of design decisions for them to continue on in their design inquiry. This enhances constructivism as they construct together and at the same time truly become a group-worthy task in which they're depending upon each other and are no longer just coexisting. There are several other benefits to learning through play, and even more benefits of learning design through shape grammars and playing with shape grammars than the ones mentioned previous. Playing naturally promotes risk-taking. People take risk when they know they're just playing a game. But often in the design studio, we don't see this type of playful risk-taking, possibly because students are afraid of not knowing which path the play will take them. By having a formal description of their design actions, shape grammars allows a student to take several paths and then return because they can see the formal expression of the moves they just performed. It's as if you're playing a musical score and you don't have notes. But when you do write down notes as you play, you'll feel free to make up melodies and harmonies, knowing you can always come back and erase the musical score throughout the design process. Playing with shape grammars also promotes divergent thinking. By using shape grammars, one is challenged to constantly look at the composition and allow their eyes to determine what are the variables and what are the pieces that one can maneuver as they move along. The pieces are constantly changing, the shapes are constantly moving as the eye detects new forms. This type of seeing is a form of flexible purposing. It allows you to use the piece that you need only at the time in which you need. Nothing is fixed, nothing is locked. Things can constantly embed and fuse, flip and rotate and manipulate as whatever your eyes see fit. The idea that one designs and has a formal description of the design actions that they're taking is very beneficial for those who approach design by copying. Copying now is not about copying the actual form, but about copying the set of actions. It's as if the actual form doesn't matter because you can take the forms and reproduce them and remake them and see them in a complete different way every time. It's the actions that one manipulate and play with. One can take one set of rules, copy those rules, and get an infinite amount of designs depending upon which shapes they apply those rules to. So by copying rules, we now have the ability to copy not by rote, but by meaningfully copying the system and the underlying principles that defines the given design. So in conclusion, I want to stress the importance for architecture and design schools to restructure their beginning design curriculums by looking at visual calculation and let calculation be the core of their curriculum and the core of the objectives for what they want their students to learn. There is a growing concept in the field of education called making learning visible. The theory states that if educators can make visible what it is their students are learning, then they could be more effective at adjusting the learning experiences in educational environments to properly match the students' level of development and learning objectives. Now, in the field of design and the field of architecture, oftentimes we're not making visible the very things we're trying to pull out of our students. We want them to be more creative. We want them to have more aesthetic sensibility. And yet these are the two things that we often avoid providing formal instruction and guidance. If we could have a formal description for these things, while allowing the same flexibility that we cherish to allow them to be creative without any boundaries, what a solution that would be to enhance our curriculums. I believe a formal description of creativity can come forth through shape grammars and through visual calculation. By allowing students to bring their ideas to life and use calculation as the core of their duties and the core of their activities, and allowing them to capture these things on paper, we're giving them a way for them to visibly see what it is that they're doing. Creativity in design no longer has to be obscure and no longer has to be a mystery. We can bring these things to life and enhance them by allowing students to use the systems of calculation and visual calculation to deeply explore their design ideas. Thank you.